Should you take classes with a native speaking English teacher or a non-native English speaking teacher? I think most of us would agree that it's good to take classes with a native speaker, right? However, I think a question that some people might disagree on is, should you take classes with an English teacher who's not a native speaker? And this is a very, very relevant topic because, let's face it, all around the world, people have classes, whether it's in their elementary school, middle school, high school, or just at private language schools. They have classes with teachers who are not native speakers. You probably know what I'm talking about. If you're learning English, which all of you are, you probably have had some experience going through classes with just an English teacher who's from your country, right? Who maybe you're from Brazil and you had an English teacher who was also Brazilian, right? Maybe a few of you didn't have that situation if you were only in like private international schools with foreign teachers, but I'm sure 99% of you have had some experience, at least with one type of class, English class, where the teacher was not a native speaker. And let's face it, that's kind of just how things are all around the world. If you don't live in an English-speaking country, you're probably going to have some type of class with a non-native speaker. So the question is that helpful? Is that harmful? Should you do that on your own? Should you hire a teacher who's not a native speaker? I think we're going to talk about some interesting stuff regarding that topic. Before I jump into that, I never do this. I'm really bad with all of the kind of social media and YouTube type stuff where I have to tell you to subscribe and click the bell and stuff like that. But I should do that. Please click on the little bell, right? Don't just subscribe, but click on the little bell, the notification bell. So every time one of these videos is released, it notifies you so you can actually watch it, right? Because most of you probably don't see when I post new videos because that's not how things work. YouTube doesn't show you all of my new videos. So click on the little bell just to get those notifications. All right, that's over. Actually, no, it's not over. Also remember that you can join my membership and become a Listening Time family member if you want my advanced podcast episodes. And you can also sign up for my US Conversations podcast if you want to practice listening to me talking at normal speed with other native speakers. It's really fun, really interesting. I recorded a conversation recently with my sister, so you won't want to miss that. So click on the links below to check those out. All right, all that is done. Let's talk about this. I've mentioned this in different podcast episodes or maybe YouTube videos. I don't know. Several times in the past, and I don't really remember what I said about this idea of having non-native English-speaking teachers. My views might be slightly different now. I don't know. But just know that what I'm saying right now is at least my opinion right now. So, like I said, most people around the world don't have a native teacher who is teaching them, right? There just aren't that many English speakers, native English speakers that are living outside of English-speaking countries who can go to those schools and be teachers, right? We will never have enough, probably, in order to fill all the schools with native speakers. That's just not realistic. So let's talk about the negatives and the positives. I'm going to be using my notes here because I wrote a lot of stuff down. So that's why I'm looking down here. I try not to cut these videos too much because as I've said before, I like when there are YouTubers or podcasters who don't really cut and edit their content that much. I think it makes for better listening, like in terms of language learning, right? Obviously, for native speakers, they want the cuts, so it's all fancy or whatever. But when you're listening, when you're doing listening practice, in my opinion, it's better to use content that isn't cut a lot, so you can just hear the natural speech, the mistakes they make. I kind of cut some of those out in my podcast episodes, but you probably don't notice that much. But I'm looking down at my notes here. Sorry that I have to kind of be a little disorganized, but I really want to be natural here. Okay, so some of the negatives I wrote down about learning from a non-native English speaker. Number one is the accuracy of their speech. Obviously, they're not going to say everything 100% correct. So sometimes you're going to hear them say wrong things, say things that are not grammatically accurate, for example, or they might use the wrong word or the wrong whatever, right? And it's not a big deal, but it could be if you are modeling your speech after that person's speech. If you're thinking that what they're saying is correct, and so you want to copy it, that's a problem if the person is not speaking accurately, right? So that can be an issue, obviously. You're hearing certain things that are not correct, and we don't want that to kind of stick in our minds as being correct, okay? So that's one thing. Another thing is that a non-native teacher can reinforce their students' mistakes, especially if they come from the same country. This is related to the accuracy thing. So the mistakes that English teacher makes, the non-native English teacher, they probably make the same mistakes that their students make because they come from the same language background. They're probably going to make a lot fewer mistakes, but the mistakes they do make are probably all the mistakes that their students make. Like, so just think of it that way. Like, if I'm a Spanish speaker and you're a Spanish speaker, I probably make the same type of mistakes that you make when we speak English, right? So when a student hears the non-native English teacher from their own country say something that's wrong, and the student doesn't know that it's wrong, it kind of reinforces, what I think is right, because that teacher is probably not making mistakes that are like way different from the mistakes that the student would make because they come from the same language background. Trust me, I've taught many thousands of hours of classes, and I know that people from the same country make the same mistakes. That's just always the case, okay? If you give me two people from the same country, I know what mistakes they're going to make already before I have the class. Like, I know a lot of them, okay? So because they have the same kind of mistakes, that teacher can reinforce the student's mistakes, right? That student thinks like, oh, okay, he says that, I say that, this must be right, okay? So that's kind of related to accuracy, but I kind of put that as a separate point. Another negative is just unnatural speech. So a non-native English teacher might say something that's correct, but it might not be natural. It might not be what I would say, for example. It might be something that sounds way too formal because it's like an academic phrase, or maybe it's just not a good collocation, meaning a good group of words, because certain words go together, right? Like there are certain phrases where it's like there's not really a reason behind it, but this type of adjective goes with this noun, right? It's like that's just kind of how it is without any logic. But a non-native speaker wouldn't have all the correct collocations. They might be using different words that don't quite go with the other words around it. You get what I'm saying? So unnatural speech is something that can obviously be a negative in this situation. We want English learners to hear native collocations, native expressions, right? Not ones that seem contrived or seem like they're direct translations of the person's language or something like that. You get my point. And one other negative, this is the biggest one probably, or I'm a little biased because I focus on the sounds of English, so maybe it's not the biggest, but it's one of the biggest, and that is the pronunciation of the teacher, okay? So a non-native English-speaking teacher is simply not going to pronounce things correctly, right? They have an accent. They don't have all of the little details. If you've watched my listening practice seminars or my pronunciation seminars, you know just how many tiny little details there are that go into the sound system and the stress system of English. There are so many things there, and it's just unrealistic to think that a non-native speaker is going to master all of that perfectly and be able to teach pronunciation well. I've seen one person, I was amazed. I've seen one person, this YouTube teacher. I'll have to check the channel later just to make sure I remember the name of the person, but she's like the only person I've ever seen that was not like a native English speaker by birth, or she didn't grow up speaking English. She learned it maybe like starting when she was a teenager, like a young adult or like a teenager or something. And I'm not talking like 12, 13. I'm talking like probably later, I think. And she like has really, really, really good pronunciation. Like you can almost not tell that she's not a native speaker. And that's like the first time I've ever seen that. So I might have gotten that story wrong, but it just came to me because I remember seeing that person's YouTube channel, and I was like, whoa, this person did a really good job. If I remember in a future video, I'll talk about her. I'll recommend her channel. You can go listen to her as well, because she might have some really good pronunciation tips on like how to improve your pronunciation or whatever. But sorry, I got off track there. But in general, it's unrealistic to think that a non-native speaker will be able to pronounce English like I pronounce it and stress their sentences and their words and reduce their words and link their words the way I do. So if you have a teacher that's not a native speaker, you're not hearing how the language actually sounds. And that's, a negative, because we want to hear the actual sounds of English, right? So you're not deceived into thinking, oh, this word is pronounced this way, right? A-N-D, that word is always pronounced and. Not true, right? That word is reduced in our sentences. So a non-native speaker might not be able to reproduce that word exactly how we reproduce it in every sentence and make it sound the way we make it sound. So that's not preparing you for the real sounds of English that you're going to hear if you just go to the US, for example. So that is one of the biggest negatives, is not hearing the correct pronunciation, the correct sounds, the correct stress, the correct linking, the correct reduced speech. You're not hearing that when you're hearing a non-native speaker talk, unless you're listening to that one English teacher that I just mentioned. She's really good. Okay, but there are positives. Those were the negatives. There are positives, though, to using a non-native English speaker as a teacher, okay? Don't just focus on all the negatives. There are positives. Number one, they often know grammar better than native speakers. I'm not saying that they apply the grammar better, because obviously they make mistakes, whereas English speakers usually just, or native English speakers usually just make mistakes. Number one, because like a slip of the tongue, they don't say it right by accident, and then they, whoops, like that was a weird sentence, and then they realize they said it wrong. Or number two, they just kind of have like neglected certain grammar rules. They never really learned them properly in school or something like that. But a non-native speaker, of course, they're going to make mistakes. However, because they've learned English to a pretty high level, they probably have a good understanding of a lot of grammar structures. Whereas if you ask the average native English speaker anything about grammar, and they will have no idea what you're talking about. Trust me, I have friends that are just monolingual English speakers, and they can't tell you the first thing about anything related to English, right? They don't know anything. They don't know what a preposition is. They don't know what a phrasal verb is. They don't know any of this stuff. Okay, that's like 99% of native English speakers. I might be exaggerating, but not by much. So a non-native English speaker can often explain grammar concepts better than a native English speaker. I remember when I was doing my English teacher training, I remember I was observing this Mexican English teacher. Obviously, English wasn't his first language, but he taught English, and his explanation of the grammar topic was like way better than my like fellow native English speaking teachers' explanation of grammar topics, right? Like the people that I was in class with who were also getting trained to become English teachers, like they were not able to explain grammar well at all. I remember that. And then I watched like this Mexican teacher, actually more than one, like 2 or 3 of them, just, very clearly explain grammar. So non-native English speakers can often be better grammar teachers. So that can be a positive. They don't always apply the grammar rules correctly when they're speaking because that's a separate skill, but their knowledge of just grammar might sometimes be better. Interestingly enough. And another positive is they know the mistakes that speakers of their language make. So if you're a Spanish speaker and you have a Spanish-speaking English teacher, they're going to know why you're making the mistakes you're making, right? Because they speak your language. They know how you're constructing your phrases. It's like me, for example, I have a friend who's learning Spanish right now, and I often a better teacher for him than, let's say, my wife, who she's not a native English speaker. She doesn't know exactly why he's making certain mistakes, like why he's phrasing things certain ways. And I do, because I'm a native English speaker. So even though I'm not a native Spanish speaker, I can actually sometimes teach that friend better, like teach him Spanish better than my wife can, because of my knowledge of why he's making certain mistakes. That's another positive. And like they can identify, I think I already said that, or like why certain mistakes are made. And then lastly, this is actually a big one. They know what it's like to learn English because they've learned it to a pretty high level, hopefully, if they're a teacher, right? So they can actually show people how they were able to do that, right? They can show people the process that they went through. And that's something that a monolingual native English-speaking teacher cannot do if they haven't learned another language, right? And so the fact that someone has learned a language already gives them a lot of like knowledge and expertise about language learning in general. And so that can help. They can kind of guide people in a different way than just someone who has not learned a language can. So that's another positive. Okay, those are the negatives and the positives. So is it beneficial to learn from a non-native speaker? I would say yes, but there are obvious limitations. Okay, I already talked about these, but the biggest two are hearing the correct sounds, right? You're not going to be able to hear the correct sounds with 99.9% of non-native English speakers, right? And the other one is just hearing natural, grammatically correct and idiomatically correct language, right? Hearing the right, phrases and structures. So those are the two big limitations, is that there are going to be times when you're not hearing the right sounds and you're not hearing the right words or phrases or grammar. Okay, those are the two limitations. However, you do benefit because you are training your speaking muscle. That's a phrase I've been using a lot recently because I really believe that this is like an important concept to grasp, that just because you've accumulated a lot of knowledge in the language, you have a great level of listening, that doesn't mean that you're going to be able to translate that to fluid and natural and accurate speech, because there's actually a muscle, a speaking muscle that you have to train, right? It's like you actually have to get the repetition of saying things out loud, okay? I'm going through this with French. There are tons of things that I know, like phrases I know, that I just can't say right now. I just don't have the repetition, the actual exercise, the actual training of having said that, phrase or whatever. That speaking muscle is separate from like everything else, okay? Once you start to develop that muscle though, then you can really start to incorporate a bunch of phrases and words that you've heard before, but you just really have to exercise that speaking muscle. And so it doesn't matter who you're talking to. You can be talking to yourself and you're exercising that speaking muscle, saying things out loud, pronouncing things, enunciating, getting the right rhythm of your sentence, copying the right tone, right, that you hear native speakers use, right, using words, seeing where your gaps are, where you can't finish the sentence because you don't know the word. And all of that is exercising your speaking muscle, okay? So you can do that with anyone. And so if you only have a non-native English speaker as a teacher, then yeah, there are limitations and there are things that are not good about that in terms of what you hear from them. However, you can speak to them and you can exercise that speaking muscle, okay? So that is a huge, benefit of talking to anyone. So I would say that that's a really big thing. You're gaining a lot of repetition just by talking and talking. You're exercising that muscle. And the teacher can probably help with a lot of your mistakes, right? Like, I'm not a native Spanish speaker. However, when I hear my friend say things, I can correct him like 99% of the time because I can identify his mistakes. I have a high enough level where, it's not a problem for me to like say, oh, that's a mistake. You need to say this, right? There are a few occasions on which I can't do that, but in general, I can do that, right? That's not a big issue for me. And so if someone has a high level of English, even if they're not a native speaker, they can still probably correct your mistakes, some of them, right? Not all of them, obviously, but some mistakes. So that's a big thing, okay? So let's address the question, should non-native speakers have the goal to become English teachers? Many people have told me that this is their goal. I get messages from people that tell me that they're trying to become an English teacher, and so they're trying to improve, their listening, their speaking, all of that. And I have people that message me that tell me that they're already English teachers, they're not native speakers, and they like use my content, to help their students, and they are messaging me to thank me for my content that they use in their classes or whatever. And that point there is kind of a key to my answer. So let me get back to that in just a minute, but just to answer the question, if you're watching this video and your passion is English and you want to be an English teacher, then yeah, why not become an English teacher, right? I'm sure that if you do a good job and you learn English to a high level, you'll be able to help people, okay? But know your limitations. Don't deny that you have some limitations, okay? So what do I mean by that? Well, I talked about those negatives before, those limitations. Well, you try to use native content to supplement your classes so that you're limiting those limitations, okay? Like when I get messages from non-native English teachers who use my content to help their students, like I view that as a really cool thing. Like that's a great addition to their class, because when people are hearing me speak, right, if they're showing them my videos or my podcast episodes, then they're actually giving their students native input, right, rather than just them talking with their accent and their mistakes or whatever. And so I think that if you are realistic about your limitations and you're using native content to kind of help you, give them something that you yourself can't give them because obviously you're not a native speaker, then that's good. And I think that another thing is you need to be honest with your students, and don't be afraid to tell them that, like, hey, I'm not a native speaker, so I'm going to say some things that are wrong, or just tell them like, sorry, I don't know the answer to that question. Let's look online right now. So don't have an ego and think that you can't tell the student that you don't know something because you're not a native speaker. You got to be honest about that, because if you're not, you're going to tell them things that aren't correct, and that's not good. Okay. So if you're just realistic about your limitations, you're using native content to kind of supplement your classes, and you're telling them, hey, I really want you to listen to this before the next class, right? Do your listening practice with this video, with this podcast episode, whatever. That will help you go in the right direction with students, right? You want to give them native content, and then you can give them the chance to practice their speaking and exercise that speaking muscle, okay? So you're good for that, right? But you have to recognize the limitations, in terms of what you say. And the other thing, this is just my opinion. You might not agree with me on this. I'm sure many people don't agree with me on this, but I really believe this is that if you're not a native speaking English teacher, you really shouldn't focus that much on pronunciation, because like I said before, you probably have, your pronunciation is probably not that similar to a native speaker's pronunciation in terms of everything, not just saying the sound correctly, but I mean the stress, the reduced speech, the linking, the reduction, like all of that it's a whole system. If you've never watched my listening practice seminars or my pronunciation seminars, I recommend that you do that, because it'll open your eyes to this, right? It's a much more than just saying, oh, buh, right? It's not, that's just a tiny little part of it, okay? So, you gotta just understand that. And so, in my opinion, you shouldn't really focus on teaching pronunciation. Maybe a little bit for like the basic things, like you can obviously correct very basic pronunciation errors, of course, right? But don't focus too much on this, because if you claim to be a pronunciation teacher, the person is going to think that your pronunciation is perfect. So that's just not something that, that's not an image you want to give to them, because they're going to be disappointed when in reality they hear other sounds when they come to the US, okay? So that's just my opinion, but I think that I'm right about that, right? Don't focus too much on pronunciation. But yeah, if this is what you really want to do in life, why not do it, right? I say go for it, but just remember these tips, okay? And if someone wants to hire you, that means they need an English teacher. So you should fill that role if you fulfill the criteria, okay? So I think that we're always going to need non-native English speakers as teachers. There just aren't enough native English speakers to teach English all around the world. So I say go for it, but do a good job and remember these tips. Lastly, because someone had asked me, like, what about when you're in a language school and you have like classmates that are also learning, and then you have to like practice with them? Like they say, oh, now you guys have this conversation about this thing, and then we'll talk afterwards. Like they make the students talk to each other. Honestly, I don't think that's great practice. At least when you're talking to a non-native English speaking teacher, you know that their knowledge is superior to yours. So they can actually offer you, some correction and guidance and things like that. With your classmate who's also learning English, you have no idea if what they're saying is correct. You have no idea about their level. So in my opinion, that's not the best practice. I don't like that that's a big thing in language classes. However, you can still benefit from exercising your speaking muscle. If you're talking to them, you're speaking, you're getting that repetition. So that's good, right? That's a benefit, but it's honestly not the best practice in terms of your input, right? Because you want to hear English that's more correct than just the average language learner, like English learners English. Okay. So I just had to throw that in there at the end because I got that question recently from someone in my membership. All right. I hope that this was interesting for you and it got you thinking, and maybe it just kind of gives you a different view, a different perspective about this topic. I want to remind you, you can practice with real conversations between people, like me talking at normal speed with other people, other native English speakers, if you sign up for my US Conversations podcast, right? If you can understand everything I'm saying in these videos, you should be using that content. You got to go to the next level. Okay, so those conversations are super interesting, super fun. Like I said, I just had one with my sister recently. That was great. I've talked to some interesting people recently. So check that out and just go down below. The link is in the description, of course. And thank you, as always, for watching this video. Remember to activate that notification bell, like I said before. And I'll talk to you in the next one. Bye-bye.